The Newsagents.
This week, to astonishingly little fanfare and not much news coverage, there were new checks being introduced at the British border for goods coming in from the EU. Flowers, delicatessen products, meats, you name it, they now have to be checked before they can get into the country, putting additional cost on it for importers and making life more complicated.
Yeah, it had been delayed 5 previous times. This week it all happened. But very little has been said about this moment by either political party. And today we're going to ask, why not? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily. And this is going to be a big moment for importers, for haulage companies, for people who are driving the lorries, for anyone who is trying to essentially get food from the EU into the UK. And it's also going to almost certainly be a big moment for consumers, because whether they trace this back to Brexit and the Brexit checks or not, they're going to see prices go up or availability go down.
Something else happened today, which is that the OECD produced figures for what the growth forecasts are for the most powerful economies in the world, the G7 economies. And guess which country is at the bottom of the league table in terms of projected growth?
France.
No.
Germany.
No.
Spain.
No. No, Spain's not part of the G7.
Sorry. Italy.
No.
Hmm.
You could have Japan, Canada, US. It's the UK.
Okay.
And again, you have to say, yes, there have been all sorts of factors around the world, an energy crisis, Ukraine, post-pandemic, la. But Britain, again, is at the bottom of the league table, according to the OECD, for growth. And the question has to be asked, how much of that is down to Brexit? But again, you kind of think, why is this getting so little attention, so little pickup, when the state of the economy and whether small businesses can operate rationally is absolutely central to what this country is?
Now, there's one very good answer to that, which is that these are not manifesting themselves in physical ways. You're not seeing big queues at Dover. You're not seeing delays. You're not seeing the lorry park round the, M25 or whatever it was. These are just adding up to individuals, to small businesses, to how they're able to charge customers, to how they're having to spend their time. And because there is so little voice, really, for them as a group, you're not really seeing it in very physical, present ways. But the costs that this may have is enormous.
Yeah, so I think what we wanted to do on the Newsagents was to say, look, this is actually quite important. It may not have got the news headlines that maybe it deserved this week, but we wanted to sort of pull the curtain back a bit and try and find out why this is happening now and what is the impact of it, how much of it can be traced back to Brexit, and why, frankly, the politicians seem to be keeping their mouths absolutely shut on it when you would have thought they might have had quite a lot to say.
So in a moment we're going to talk to Tim Shipman, and Tim has been so prolific in his books about Brexit. He traces, if you like, the history of the moment and its fallout since 2016, and he's got a new book coming out later. But we're going to start with Peter Foster, the FT's Financial Times' Peter Foster, who has written about Brexit, where Brexit went wrong. No, wait, I've got this wrong, but you've also got this wrong. You get it right.
This is hopeless. We've got an author, a mateless doing the introduction. I'm the only one who knows what the book is called. What went wrong with Brexit and what can we do about it? And it's great, Peter, to have you in the studio. So,
will you just actually tell us what's happened this week, just to take everyone to square one? The new checks that came in on Tuesday, what do they really mean?
So after 5 years, 5 delays, finally the border came in. It actually started in January when anybody sending food and animal products from the EU into the UK needed an export health certificate, which is a big long form that a vet has to sign and stamp, saying where the goods came from and all the bits and pieces. But what happened this week, April the 30th, is the physical checks. So when the goods get to the border, they have to be inspected in a border post. If they're flagged, actually very few will get physically checked. But that also requires all the people moving plant and animal products to enter all the goods into a system called IPAFS. I forget what that stands for, but it's a system where you register the goods, and
so
then
you have to say what is in the back of your lorry.
You have to say what is in the back of your lorry, and they also have to pay, if they're coming through Dover and Eurotunnel, what's called a common user charge. And so that's a charge. If your goods are low risk, it's £10 a go. If they're medium and high risk, it's £29 a go. And this is where it gets technical. Maximum of 5 £29 charges per CHED, right, which is a common health entry document. So you add that up, you get to £145 maximum charge. But that's not, really importantly, the maximum charge that a lorry could face, because they might have multiple consignments.
So how many could you have in one lorry then?
Well, the Controlled Cold Chain Federation, which is one of the trade groups, has done some maths, and you could get up to thousands of pounds for a lorry if you had multiple different consignments of multiple different goods. I mean, that's pretty unlikely. But I spoke to a business, for example, that employs 30, 40 people, imports Hungarian and Eastern European products into the UK for about 120 different shops. And his customs agents told him it'll be about £8,800 a month in extra charges. Wow. That's a lot of money for a business of his size. So that's the kind of numbers you're talking about. It's non-trivial. Different if you're Asda or whoever, right? Because you're importing whole lorry loads of salami, etc. And then, of course, £145 on a 40-foot container of salami is nothing. So as ever, it lands on smaller businesses.
So why are we hearing so little about it, given that, we kind of love to venerate our small businesses in this country, and yet they seem to be the ones that are going to be screwed by this?
Yeah, but they don't have a collective voice. They don't have mega brands. They're not Tesco and Asda. And the government's going to make very sure that these new checks don't cause queues at the border. So TV crews can't go, oh, look, there's long queues at the border. And so just like it happened the other way, actually, when we moved out of the EU single market and the checks came in on stuff going from Great Britain into the EU, what happened was that loads of small businesses just gave up trading.
So do you think that's going to happen now? I mean, when you speak to small businesses, are they saying these £8,000 costs will be passed on to consumers, or are they saying we just can't offer the variety, or are they packing up and going home because it's just not worth it?
So all of that. You're outside the single market. And of course, we've been facing the paperwork to go into the EU from the January the 1st, 2021. What's happening now is stuff coming from the EU is facing paperwork to go into the UK.
And that's our choice. That is our choice. It is
our choice, but also it's a WTO commitment. You can't treat different trade partners differently.
Yeah.
So at some point you have to erect a border. But also Brexit means Brexit, right? It's unfair fundamentally if all of our traders are facing massive bureaucracy to send stuff to Europe and, we're not levelling the playing field the other way. Of course, the trouble with that argument is 53% of our trade is with Europe. It's actually gone up since Brexit because the trade with the rest of the world has stagnated. We're a much smaller proportion of European trade, and so they're prepared to make less effort. It depends which country you're talking about. It's important to the Dutch and the Danes, for example, for pig meat, but it's a different dynamic. They're big and we're small.
Peter, can I just ask you about the consumer in all of this? Because we talk about a cost of living crisis. If costs are going up, then the importers are going to have to pass that on to the consumer. But will the consumer think, oh, blimey, that's because of Brexit? Or they're going to think, oh, that's because of inflation generally, and you will never know the element that Brexit has played in this?
No, I mean, I think that's the point, isn't it? I was talking to somebody from Ipsos, the polling organisation, who says that Brexit, as a salience issue, as an issue of importance for voters, is lower than it's been since 2015.
Wow.
It's not on the radar, and yet food costs are part of people's concerns when they come to vote in an election, as are, for example, not having enough dentists. Now, both of those are impacted by Brexit, but I don't suppose anybody walks into the dentist or waits for their dentist appointment and goes, God, damn old Brexit, or goes into the supermarket and goes, God, those are pricey tomatoes, it must be Brexit. Some politically motivated people will be, but there's a load of other noise. There's been an energy crisis, there's been a war in Ukraine, there are lots of other contributing factors.
And that suits, presumably, both main parties.
Precisely. So
right?
In a normal world, if the blue team had made an absolute hash of something, the red team would be pointing at it and go, look what a mess they've made, your tomatoes are more expensive. But because, Labour doesn't want to alienate those voters in the red wall in the north west and the northeast who voted for Brexit, the ones they're trying to get back from Boris Johnson, because it doesn't want to alienate them. It doesn't see any political point in making a song and dance about it and pointing a finger at it. I mean, there's another element to it, which is that, Keir Starmer has said, I'm not going to rejoin a customs union with the EU, and I'm not going to go back into the EU single market. Well, if those are your red lines, then what you might do to fix the problems is going to have a fairly limited benefit, right? So if you point the finger at the cost of tomatoes and someone says, what are you going to do about it? But the answer to that question is, well, not a massive amount. I mean, they are going to do a veterinary deal. That will help. But it's not going to change the price of fish or tomatoes massively.
Do you believe that if Labour comes to power, wins the general election, that maybe that language changes a bit, that policy changes a bit, because they will have achieved what they wanted to do, which was to get the red wall voters over, they have a majority, and then suddenly a bit more pro-European?
I think they will be pro-European in the sense that David Lammy has always said he wants to go back and do a partnership security agreement with the EU. They'll be less zero-sum, right, in their approach with the EU. I'm not sure, unless there's real economic pressure, they're going to change the red line on the customs union, because if they do, they're going to have to then re-ravel or unravel trade deals that we've done with Australia and New Zealand, and they're going to get back into a tough negotiation with the EU, which isn't going to yield immediate and brilliant economic benefits, and is going to reawake all those old Brexit demons. And if you're Keir Starmer, do you want to plunge your administration back into another exhausting negotiation with the EU? I mean, we saw it just the other week. I don't know if listeners followed the business about the youth mobility scheme, where the EU offered a scheme to allow 18 to 13-year-olds to travel freely. And Labour immediately set that down. They just said, we're not going to do that. We think that's free movement of people by the back door. Now, would that change after election? Maybe. But it's still going to be a difficult negotiation, right? The EU is going to say, well, we want, our students to come to your universities only pay the $9,250 that your guys pay. The university is going to tell the government, you can't do that. We're making a loss on those students as it is. You can't send us tens of thousands of European students, right? What about Erasmus? We want you to join that student exchanges. Well, the Exchequer's going to say to the Chancellor, you can join Erasmus if you want. You're going to put in £2 billion more than you took away. At that point, the opposition Tory party, who presumably, have gone further to the right if they've lost badly, are going to be saying, look, Keir Starmer, Brussels poodle, giving $2 billion to Europe for nothing, spend the $2 billion on our kids. You can just see how Labour will still be more cautious, I think, than some people think.
Can I just ask you a kind of other end of the telescope question? I did a thing quite recently with Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, who said, and it kind of...
I did a thing. I love the euphemism that simple little line implies.
But it really kind of jolted me when he said to me something along the lines of, what makes you think that the European Union would want Britain back with all the headaches that Britain has brought?
They've said that clearly until the Tories and Labour are on the same side of that argument, which is, who knows? I mean, generationally, almost impossible to think
presumably
about
the ask would be that if you want to come back in, you're back in Schengen, you're going to be in the single currency.
Well, it's not back in. You start again.
You
start from
exactly.
the beginning.
And you have absolutely
nothing. That's what they said to Scotland, right?
You have absolutely nothing that you had negotiated before.
I mean, I think, there's no prospect of the UK rejoining until it's obvious to all sides that that's what we're going to do. So if you had a referendum, it's going to be 80-20 in favour. Nobody wants a Britain...
58-40.
Yeah,
52,
nobody
48.
wants that. But I do think... Well, two things. One is relations with the EU are not that bad now, right? Post-Windsor framework, Rishi Sunak has a perfectly good relationship with Ursula von der Leyen. They're constrained by red lines on free movement, on trade, etc. And those red lines are going to move a bit. So, and the Labour government is going to do a veterinary deal, it says, which is going to try and reduce some of those checks at the border we were talking about at the start. It's going to do a load of things that will make it feel a bit warmer.
I mean, I don't want to sort of rehash the Rwanda debate, but Keir Starmer's comments last night made it very clear that they end the Rwanda flights because they will be doing more repatriation deals with the EU, which is kind of all...
I mean, we'll believe that when we see it.
You don't think so?
Well, I don't think you walk into repatriation deals. Like a lot of this stuff, none of it is going to happen overnight. And, there's something they say in the Foreign Office sometimes, which is, Labour will spend its first term learning to hate Europe, right? Which is, it's frustrating. Being a third country...
Do you think we don't have a pro-European party in either Labour or the Conservatives now.
I think Keir Starmer is pro-European. I think Keir Starmer is not afraid of the single market and the European court. He's not allergic. He's not an allergic sovereigntist, which is the problem with the Tory party, is they just couldn't go near it. But, being a third country, as they call it in Europe, the demandeur, being a small country, means that I don't think any of this stuff is going to be...
falls into our lap.
Yeah. And I think, and so then if you're Keir Starmer, you have to... I think they will do stuff, to be clear. It will feel warmer, but I don't think the sky, the clouds, the seas are going to part, right? It's going to be iterative. There's going to be some nice warm music at the start where we have our Security Partnership Council and we all talk about our common threat with Ukraine. And David Lammy and the Labour Party, assuming David Lammy becomes the Foreign Secretary, have said they want to reheat that partnership, get British diplomats back in the room. Remember, there's a quarterly meeting of all the chancellors and prime ministers of Europe. They meet every quarter. We're not there. So we need to get back in the room. So I think all of that stuff will happen. I don't think it's going to suddenly change the price of fish.
Just a final question. Headline in the Times: UK economy will be worse performing in G7 next year, says OECD. How much of that is Brexit?
I think a chunk of it. You can always point at things that, are counterfactual. But the truth is, Brexit, the most important thing that Brexit did was create a massive distraction, right? It created all of that political uncertainty as the Tory party tried to resolve what it thought Brexit meant. And that uncertainty, that flip-flopping, 1 minute we're going to rip up all EU law by the end of the year, it's not stuff that bothers consumers. It does bother investors. It makes the UK look like a flip-flop economy. And people who invest on 10 and 15-year horizons, they've looked at the UK the last few years, and they've seriously questioned whether the UK is a good place to do business. Brexit is certainly part of that picture, I think is the way you would say that. And actually one of the dividends of a Labour government will not be they've clicked their fingers and done a massive deal with Brussels. It will actually be convincing the market and investors that Keir Starmer has a stable 10-year plan and there will be a kind of sensibleness dividend.
So what you're saying is it's actually not the effect of Brexit itself, it's just the lack of clarity of what we were actually doing.
Yeah, but investors want to know, well, what is your position vis-a-vis EU chemical regulations? What is your position on the border? 5 times the border's been delayed. What is your position on net zero? All of that, all of that uncertainty clouds the picture for investment. And if you want growth, you need investment.
Peter, thank you so much. Brilliant.
That was so helpful.
Yeah.
Really helpful.
We have talked a lot about the economics of Brexit just now. Let's talk the politics, which have been confounding, confusing, astonishing, depressing. And there is one person who has chronicled this uniquely with insights from speaking to absolutely everybody under the sun. And that is the Sunday Times chief political columnist, Tim Shipman, whose new book is out now. Tim, remind us of the title of the new one.
No Way Out is book 3.
Yes, No Way Out is book 3, and there is going to be a book 4.
There is a book 4 coming, which I've nearly finished, which will be called Out, and that's out in June. So book 3 is kind of a lot of the Theresa May traumas, and then Boris Johnson getting elected as Tory leader. Book 4 is basically Johnson, Truss and Sunak, and that's coming quite soon.
So what is it that we didn't understand that your book this time round makes us understand more clearly? Was it that Theresa May tried and was just hopeless and failed? Or is that a far too simple an analysis of it?
That's a fair sort of one-sentence summary, but I think what she got wrong was kind of not just that she sort of set off and didn't succeed. She when she set off, she didn't really know where she was going. It took her quite a long time to work out where she wanted to go. When she decided where she wanted to go, where she specifically wanted to go wasn't really where anybody else really wanted to go. She tried to eventually combine kind of staying as close as possible economically whilst outside the political institutions, and outside some of those economic institutions as well, the single market and the customs union. But, whilst taking a pretty hard line on immigration and that sort of thing. And that ended up sort of satisfying nobody. And in the end, by the time she worked out what she wanted to do in the spring of 2018 into the summer of 2018, she'd already alienated a lot of people who thought she was either going too hard or too soft. She hadn't made a principled argument for a kind of situation where, you say we're out of the politics, but we stay close on the economics. Because she didn't know where she was going, she didn't sort of plot a path, and I think she got a lot of the tactics and the strategy kind of completely wrong. And ultimately, if you don't know where you're going and you haven't got a plan to get there, it makes the third bit of being good at politics even more difficult, which is that you need to take other people with you. And if she'd managed to get the first two right, even then she probably wouldn't have been a terribly persuasive advocate. But having got the first two wrong, it then just became sort of a complete mess, really.
Do you think the personal always overtakes ultimately the politics? Do you think, however Theresa May had done in that job, Boris Johnson would always have wanted it?
Yeah, I think that's true to a degree, but equally there are various scenarios in this whole history where Boris Johnson might have got the job in 2016 if Michael Gove hadn't knifed him. There's a lot of sort of untrodden paths here. Theresa May took the slightly perverse decision to bring Boris Johnson into her government, but then to give him no power or influence over the subject which he was kind of felt himself kind of existentially responsible for. She brought the three Brexiteers in, Johnson and Davis and Liam Fox, and then cut them out completely and did the whole sort of Brexit piece really with her and a couple of her closest aides in Number 10, plus Oliver Robbins, chief negotiator. And the sort of structurally how she set it up meant that none of those Brexiteers were forced to make any of the compromises that she in the end felt she had to make. They sort of stood outside that decision-making process. Nor were they made to feel part of it. And you can imagine a world in which Boris Johnson could have accepted some compromises and then sold them to the Leave voters. Now, he could have done that potentially as leader, but he might have, if she'd played it slightly differently, she might have been able to get him to do that in government. Because don't forget, he didn't resign for the whole of 2017 and half of 2018, where quite difficult decisions were made.
Tim, just to bring you to where your fourth book will take us, which is into the administrations of Johnson, Truss and Sunak. I mean, in a way, this question's very obvious, but do you feel that Brexit ties all of them together? We only had those leaders because of Brexit? To
a degree, that's true. I think what Brexit's done is kind of overshadowed everything. Not everything that's happened, certainly for the last 2 years, has been about Brexit, but the context is that those leaders have got themselves selected by a Conservative Party that has been through this enormous trauma, which is kind of comparable to the ousting of Margaret Thatcher in the kind of existential effect it had on people inside the Conservative Party, which Brexit kind of revealed but also entrenched divisions in the country, but also within the Conservative Party. And so Liz Truss was kind of elected because of those divisions, and Rishi Sunak didn't win. Then when she failed with a fairly extreme form of what Brexit might look like as the sort of Singapore-on-Thames, that was kind of what her government was all about, trying to create. When that didn't work, then Sunak's then a reaction against that. I don't think everything that's going on with the Tory party at the moment is necessarily overtly Brexit related, but I think it goes back to those divisions and the fact that while he was a Brexiteer, Sunak is seen as kind of culturally a Remainer, as sort of a bit too conciliatory and compliant and not the kind of bang and cheer from the rooftops kind of figure which Brexiteers came to want, and they saw that with Boris Johnson, and that's what frustrated them about Theresa May. So I think there's kind of a whole bunch of personal effects here where rivalries and sort of personal hatreds that developed during the Brexit process have kind of affected the psychodrama in the Tory party, even when, the subject matter is not overtly about Brexit. And then, of course, we have the supreme irony at the moment that Sunak is wrestling with, a legal immigration issue, which in essence was created for him by Boris Johnson, who is still supported much more by the people who are enraged by
and
Sunak's
also created by Brexit,
position.
in the sense that that was where we ended our cooperation deals with other EU states.
Yeah, and they then created a points-based system where effectively we ended freedom of movement with Europe and created a version of freedom of movement for the rest of the world. And as a consequence, because Johnson was never a sort of closed borders Brexiteer like Theresa May was, we then had a situation where his version of Brexit involved quite a lot more people coming in from the subcontinent and other parts of the world. He just put them on a sort of equal footing with the EU. And if you had the money, you could come in, essentially, if your salary was over a certain level. And they didn't, what most of the Tory right would now say was that was set at the wrong level. But the irony is that those people would still cheer if Boris Johnson returned as Tory leader, and he was the one who created that. And they all seem to dislike Rishi Sunak, who's much more right-wing on immigration.
It's personality, not politics.
Exactly. Well, I think
he could have sold them anything, is what you're saying. Really.
Well, I mean, I think that the key with Boris Johnson was that when he was Prime Minister, the ERG and the sort of hardline Brexiteers acknowledged privately that whatever Boris Johnson said was Brexit would be accepted as such by the Leave voter, and that was not the case with Theresa May. And I think that would have given him, it certainly did give him more leeway when he was Prime Minister. And I think if he'd got in 2016, I think it's possible to say that he would have had more leeway to compromise than she did.
Yes, but if you take the arc of this, and you go from Cameron to May, to Johnson, to Truss, to Sunak, 5 prime ministers.
Since 2015.
Can any of them look back and say, yeah, I nailed it, I got it right?
What, Brexit?
Because the lingering after effect of it, just
Look,
instability it's caused politically and economically is still there.
Yes, no, that's true. But at the end of the day, people voted for it, and that was then a situation that those Prime Ministers had to deal with. It would have been the same for someone who felt differently about Brexit as well, I suspect. I think if you look at when this was done competently, and I'm sure you and a lot of your listeners would disagree that it was done in the right way for the right ends, but if you look at the second half of 2019, you had a Prime Minister and a Chief Aide who had helped win the referendum, who did at that point know what they were trying to achieve. The civil servants all working with them acknowledged that too, and a lot of them were quite refreshed by the fact that it was pretty clear what the plan was, and the tactics they used were pretty unpalatable to a lot of people, but they did get what they wanted ultimately, and they won a stonking great election victory off the back of it. And if you're looking for the one period of sort of a sustained kind of political competence, put aside, whether you agree with the ends, I think that period of Johnson and Cummings kind of working in harmony was the one moment. And lots of people, who I know in the Tory party who have worked in and around Downing Street during, several of these administrations would say that was the one moment where it felt like it was functioning properly. And then, of course, those two massive egos, they'd achieved what they wanted. They were falling out dramatically even in January of 2020, long before COVID hit, and then COVID kind of drove them apart, and the rest of the Johnson government was the same shambles that we've seen every other
So
time.
Tim, just take that moment, the 2019 election campaign, and that slogan, unforgettable slogan, Get Brexit Done. 5 years on, do you think that Rishi Sunak's government will still be talking about that? Will they want to take the getting of Brexit done to the people as a triumph?
No, because anyone who knows anything about Brexit knows that it's not done and that it's going to be a process forevermore.
Will we hear Brexit mentioned, do you think, in the forthcoming general election
that's
campaign?
a good question.
I think the moment when it would become an issue during the election would be if the Labour Party leant further or harder into what they might do next in government. Now, it's pretty clear what's on the table. Both the Labour Party and the people in Brussels would like a security deal. Labour would also like to go and do some kind of veterinary deal that would bring us closer and remove a lot of the barriers that you've just been talking about on, food imports and all the rest of it. Quite a lot of work has already been done by civil servants, particularly under Sunak, quietly, without the sort of bluster and excitement that we've had previously.
You're talking about the Windsor Framework.
Well, he did the Windsor Framework, and then he did the follow-up deal, which kind of ironed out some of the problems in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
But sort of unseen to all of us, there's been quite a lot of work going on the trade and customs agreement, which was Johnson's deal in 2020, behind the scenes to sort of iron out a lot of the problems. The EU doesn't regard this as kind of politically toxic in the way it used to. It's pretty confident that other countries aren't going to leave. And, people in the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office have been quietly working with people in Brussels for a long time to sort of make that a bit smoother. So if Labour came in, I think they'd find a lot of the sort of low-hanging fruit on that. And is not available. If they want to go further, they're going to have to do some kind of new deal, and we know what the EU would like. They'd like a youth mobility deal and some sectoral mobility deals, and that's certainly what they were offering, as Book 4 will show. When David Frost was doing his negotiating in 2020, they were amazed that we weren't prepared to accept sort of some sectoral deals. There was a lot of fuss at the time about bands struggling to go and tour in Europe and things like that. Didn't need to be a problem because Johnson and Frost wanted a kind of sovereignty first, kind of pure Brexit. We didn't do all that, and that's kind of been sitting there waiting to be done. But the second that you start talking about mobility deals in the context of legal migration at the levels that it's currently at, that's the sort of thing that a canny Conservative Party operation could then sort of weaponise in a lot of those red wall seats and make life more difficult for Starmer than he needs to make it. So it seems to me there's a reason why Labour's keeping its head down on these issues, and if they don't bring them up, there's not a great story for the Tories to tell either that would mean that they would want to.
So the 2019 election, which is Get Brexit Done, the only issue really that matters, yes, Corbyn and his electability, very much another issue. But Get Brexit Done is everything. And yet and the next general election in 2024 is going to don't mention Brexit. Brexit, we're not even going to talk about it on either side. Even though the issues, a lot of them, remain unresolved. It is extraordinary, isn't it, that there's a conspiracy of silence from both parties.
No, I think that's right, and let's blame the parties rather than the media. I think
I think it is the parties.
If there was anything to get into, we'd be very happy to get into it. I tried writing a piece about what the Labour Party might do a few weeks ago, and the thinking appears, on the surface at least, to be remarkably kind of simplistic rather than highly sophisticated. So
what do you mean by that?
Well, look, they may have done loads of thinking about specific regulations and things that they might want to do, but at the moment it's very kind of, we'll do a security deal. Everyone can see some benefit to that in the context of Ukraine and a possible Trump victory, which makes life difficult for NATO. You can talk about the desire for a veterinary deal, but when you ask them what they would give up to get it, you don't really get many answers. And I sort of saw recently some senior Labour people who deal with their foreign and European policy, and they wanted to talk about the Middle East, they wanted to talk about the US and how they would approach that. Didn't want to talk about Brexit much.
Tim, can I ask you something? If you were a war reporter, we'd talk about you being embedded, I guess. Sort of in the bunker, embed. Sort of on the planes and embed. You've written so much, probably more extensively than any other journalist I can think of, about the history and the politics of Brexit. Has it taken you with it? Have you found yourself sort of leaning much more towards the way the country voted, or the reasons behind Brexit, or the sort of passions within it? Do you think? Do you feel like it has taken you along?
Yeah, a little bit, and particularly in that period, sort of autumn of 2018 to mid 2019. I think quite a lot of people in Westminster got very het up. Some of them, we're not supposed to use words like mad, but everybody went a bit mad, I think, for a period. The amount of emotion and sort of anger on both sides, people not wanting to compromise with each other, that was pretty toxic for a lot of people in that environment. Politicians, for cabinet ministers, MPs, journalists, everybody found themselves in that to a degree. I think it's reinforced my view that, to answer your question from earlier, I think a lot of politics is personal. It is about people joining teams and gangs and hanging out together and beating the other lot. A lot of decisions are made, some of them for ideological reasons, some of them for principled reasons, and I think it's very, very difficult to divorce those sort of personal motivations from the sort of ideas of belief and common sense and all the rest of it. And people say, you focus too much on the sort of psychodrama and the people rather than on the policy, but most policy is driven to one degree or another by where people feel they should position themselves or who their friends are. And when you step outside those groups of kind of friendship and alliance, it gets very difficult. Michael Gove's existence for the last 7 or 8 years has been conditioned by the fact that he did step outside the kind of social groups that he joined and the political kind of ideological groups that he joined, and that gets very, very awkward for people. The questions I've found most difficult to answer when writing all this stuff is, what was, once you got sufficiently far down the track that we got to that sort of point towards the end of 2018 where the battle lines were clear, what was the good outcome here? Because in 2016, what was probably palatable to both sides was, looked a lot more kind of moderate than where we ended up. And by the end, these sort of two armed camps, the only two really logical positions by the end of it were kind of no deal or referendum and revoke. Parliament is supposed to be there to sort of solve these battles and resolve the differences and come up with an answer, and for so long it didn't, that made the situation even more complicated. And I think, the answer I could never get from people who wanted to sort of revisit the result was, what's the good outcome here with if we have a referendum? I didn't vote for Brexit. I thought it would be economically problematic, and more to the point, I thought the British state would struggle to handle the negotiation or taking advantage of it, and that's probably the only reasonably prescient thing I've ever thought in my life as a journalist. But equally, I found it difficult when talking to really very clever people on the sort of Remain side, like Dominic Grieve or some of the other people in those camps, saying, if you get your referendum and you reverse the result, where does this go? What's the good outcome here? And I never felt there was a particularly persuasive answer to that question.
Really interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for
Tim, thank you.
talking us through it. Well, before we go, there is the pressing matter of what on earth is happening in Scotland. We saw the week start with the resignation of Humza Yousaf, and it looks as if, in the space of just 3 short days, we know who the next First Minister and the next leader of the SNP will be. Do I need a drum roll here? Do you want a little da-da-da-da-da-da-da?
No, that was not a drum roll you gave.
What was it? A fanfare?
You gave a fanfare, not a drum roll.
Yeah, it should be bagpipes.
You should know the difference.
Okay. Well, anyway, it looks like it's going to be John Swinney, who is a long-term leader of the party many years ago, and he was Nicola Sturgeon's deputy. So he would have been essentially the ultimate Sturgeon continuity candidate. Now I guess he looks like a break from Humza Yousaf's government. But the important thing to understand is that he is going into this, what would have been a race, uncontested, because the only other person we were waiting to hear from is Kate Forbes,
the former finance minister, and she has put a long thread out on Twitter, which kind of took us a little while to get to the nub of it. But the nub of it is, I've therefore weighed the decision whether or not to seek the leadership of the party with great care. I've concluded that the best way to deliver the urgent change Scotland needs is to join with John Swinney and advocate for that reform agenda within the Scottish Government. So Kate Forbes has been brought into the tent in a way that Humza Yousaf most certainly wanted to keep her out of the tent. And Kate Forbes, John Swinney are going to work together. What that means for so much of Scottish politics, well, that remains to be seen about whether they change course. But John Swinney announced that he was running earlier on today, and this is what he said.
Thank you for joining me at the Grassmarket Community Project, a venture that brings hope to some of the most vulnerable people in our society in the setting of a social enterprise. This place reflects my values, who I am, and it's therefore the right place for me to confirm that I intend to stand for election as leader of the Scottish National Party. I want to build on the work of the SNP government to create a modern, diverse, dynamic Scotland that will ensure opportunity for all of her citizens. I want to unite the SNP and unite Scotland for independence.
And I think it raises some really interesting questions, because last week Humza Yousaf, getting rid of his Green partners in the coalition, basically signalled that the party would have to go in a very different direction. It would have to rid itself of some of the cultural issues baggage, whether it was around the Caste report, about gender self-ID, about the net zero targets that they then couldn't stick with, and take it in a more sort of retail-friendly, punter-friendly direction, which was just about cost of living. By making Swinney now the leader, what they're essentially doing is going back to the Sturgeon administration. And he brings to this new administration much of the baggage of the old one. So will the SNP really cut the ties with what they used to do when he was right at the centre of that one? It is definitely not time for change.
No, it is Back to the Future, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because John Swinney was the leader of the SNP 20 years ago and saw the party go backwards electorally and therefore was seen as a bit of a problem. So if John Swinney is the solution now and he was the problem then, what has changed in the intervening years? Also, fine, Kate Forbes is back inside the tent, but she has a very different vision of what Scotland needs to do to be generating economic growth and all the rest of it. So, how does this bed itself down? I think I would make the point, though, that given where the SNP were a couple of days ago, or just the bumpiness of the past week, I think they've got themselves to the least worst option, where they're not going to have a kind of mudslinging, eating each other contest. Seems to be an outbreak of unity, with John Swinney saying to Kate Forbes, come in, and Kate Forbes saying, yeah, I accept, we're doing this for the good of our country and for the good of independence. And so therefore I kind of think, you know what? They're not in as bad a place as they might have been.
I would say that this is now not a party of ideology. The SNP famously is all about independence. It's about nationalism. Right now, they are not a party of ideology. They're a party of pragmatism. All they want to do is get themselves into a war footing, battle ready for a general election without being completely wiped out of Scotland by Labour.
We will be back tomorrow with some local council election
we
results.
will. I was going to take the bank holiday off, but
No,
just
you're
reminded
not.
me. No.
And also, tomorrow is not a bank holiday. I know Friday every day for Emily Maitlis is a bank holiday, but it isn't.
Yes, well, I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward to adding my wisdom.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.